Looks like we're recording. And guys, I'm so excited to have on the program Gail Eisnitz, who has this incredible career of investigating slaughterhouses and factory farms and all sorts of animal exploitation industries. I am a little embarrassed to confess that Gail didn't come on my radar until recently. I was really stunned to learn about the depth of your career. Gail is the chief investigator at Humane Farming Association, as you can see on your screen. By the way, I should mention, if you're just watching this, there's also an audio podcast version you can get on Audible, Amazon, Apple, wherever you download those podcasts. But where I really want to start with Gail is her new memoir, which is called Out of Sight, an undercover investigator's fight for animal rights and her own survival. First, let me just welcome you to the program. It's really great to have you, Gail.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm so glad you found me.
Yeah. Well, I want to confess something to you about your memoir before we start, and this will be a compliment, by the way. But when I learned about your book, I've had a real interest in making an effort to promote people's work when they're writing about animal rights. So when I discovered your book, and I saw that this was going to be about slaughterhouse investigations and stuff, I've now read a lot of that stuff. So I thought, wow, this is going to be so grim. And so I confess that I approached, interviewing you as sort of like an assignment. So I thought, I'm definitely going to read this book, but what am I really going to learn? And what ended up happening, I finished your book this morning, was your book broke through and had numerous gut punch moments that kind of made me feel things. And it's really interesting, like a lot of your book has several themes, and I'll shut up in a second, but one of them that I took away is that your book has a theme of feeling and detachment. Like, you spent all your career dealing with these horrific exposing horrific animal abuse. And you talk a lot about how you had to kind of shut down your feelings. And there were just numerous moments in your book where I actually felt something. And I observed something in myself, which I was feeling the things the most when you were talking about your story and your friends and your family. So maybe let's just start there. Let's just start about, some of those themes that you approached with your book. Because this is also a story about your life and what was going on behind the scenes while you exposed all this, dealing with multiple health issues.
Right. Yeah. I wrote it. It's kind of like an interesting balancing act for me when I talk about it, because I tend to talk about animal abuse. I've been doing that for 43 years. And I want people to know how horrible things are. But I shouldn't really do that, because I wrote the book in a way that it wouldn't just be about animal atrocities. It would be about personal atrocities as well. It kind of is. It kind of focuses on a very rare visual processing disorder that I have, and it follows my efforts to get a diagnosis, which was very, very, very long in coming. And as a result, it reads like a mystery. And most of the reader reviews on Amazon say that the readers can't put the book down because they want to find out what happens. So it's kind of like a two-pronged attack. It looks at my career as an investigator into farm animal abuses while I was enduring a very difficult visual processing problem.
Yeah, and I even struggle to describe this problem because it wasn't just visual. It was, very consuming. It seemed like it would leave you very disoriented, sometimes unsafe. And as you mentioned, this was decades and decades, pretty much your entire life you were dealing with this, which is why I find it even more extraordinary that you and that's another theme of your book, is just perseverance. You were dealing with this all the while, doing these incredible investigations and very demanding investigations that required you to persevere through multiple obstacles. And so my hat's off to you. It's an incredible story. And by the way, we should mention, we're not going to mention what the ultimate conclusion was and what you finally, just several years back, discovered what it was you were suffering from all this time, because we want to leave some mystery. But that's one of the things that really draws you into the book, is that feeling of heartbreak and helplessness that you were feeling all this while, even as you've described. One of the struggles that you had was like with family and friends and stuff not understanding. And there's even a point, and it's kind of towards the end of the book, where you're starting to wonder, am I just crazy? And your family, and there was a moment where you sort of felt like you had lost your family, like they were talking to you like, this is all in your head. So yeah, that's a really hard thing, I'm sure, that you had to go through, like all these decades of struggle. How are you able to go through these extreme investigations while dealing with this, where sometimes you weren't even seeing properly?
Yeah, I mean, to give you listeners a little background, my vision is pixelated. I see the world as dotted, but that's just least of my problems, because it also caused what I call dyslexia of the world, where things just didn't make sense. It's like looking in a funhouse mirror. And it also caused derealization, which is a feeling of not being present in your own body. Like you can't figure out what's real and what's not real. It's extremely scary. And it happened all the time. It was awful.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't feel I had a choice. I felt like I had to continue with my investigations, because what choice did I have? And I also thought, after many years of seeing many doctors, and them all telling me there's nothing wrong with you, I blamed myself for the problem, and I thought I was crazy. So I just didn't feel like I had a choice, but I had to soldier on and do what was necessary to document these horrific violations that I was finding out about, and was getting no support from my supervisors at my first employer, which was the Humane Society of the U.S.
Right.
So that was very demoralizing. So I had to
Yeah.
quit. I had to quit and go to Humane Farming Association to continue my slaughterhouse investigation.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to some of those early days of the investigations. One of the recurring people in your book is this guy, Timothy Walker, this friend of yours who was a whistleblower. And that, it seems like it sort of all started there with Timothy. Tell me a little bit about Timothy, because I know you guys had this really special friendship. And then also, what was the stuff that he had brought to your attention?
Right. Yeah, he sent me a sort of anonymous letter. It was anonymous in that it wasn't signed, but he did put his return address on the envelope, so I was able to track him down. And the anonymous letter, he was a USDA animal health technician. He wasn't supposed to be working in slaughterhouses, because he wanted to help animals, and that's why he became an animal health technician to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. But his job put him inside slaughterhouses to test dead cows for brucellosis. And what he found out was that some of the cows, a lot of the cows that he was testing that were supposed to be dead, were still alive while they were having their heads skinned. So he wrote letters. Well, he told every level of supervisor in his job. He wrote to Congress. He wrote to the Veterans Administration, because he was a veteran. about this problem, and nobody answered. Then he wrote to a bunch of animal groups, and nobody answered except for me. So I went down to Florida, where it was the largest slaughterhouse in the southeastern United States. It was a cow kill, and I was able to verify his claims. The veracity was incredible. I checked with other brucellosis testers. I got affidavits from workers, that this was a problem. And eventually we were able to file a lawsuit against the USDA, and the lawsuit ended up in saying it established the fact that Timothy was correct in what he was claiming, because they fired him. They fired him for speaking out. Yeah. And so the lawsuit was a whistleblower lawsuit, and we sued the USDA over the Whistleblower Protection Act. And it ended up determining that his allegations were correct, and requiring the USDA to conduct an investigation. And so the investigation was conducted. Timothy was allowed to return to work in a different capacity, and the plant mysteriously shut down after the investigation. And then the investigative findings were released by USDA, saying it was a wonderful plant, and it was a glowing review. Yeah. But the plant shut down, went out of business permanently, and it had plans to expand. So that was quite a nice surprise. But it wasn't enough for Timothy, because it turned out that when he found out what I was documenting across the United States, he wanted to expose violations nationwide. He didn't want the plant to shut down because he wanted his day in court so he could talk about what was going on there. I mean, he was happy that it shut down, but he didn't want the case to be over.
Yeah. Well, one of the brilliant things about your book is that, you start talking about cows being skinned alive. We're talking about really harrowing, awful things. What your book does is sort of intersperse your story, dealing with the visual issues and the search for answers about that with this really disturbing stuff. And it is difficult to read. I want to say to people out there, though, make sure you push through those moments, because I have to sort of like backtrack to before I had read a lot of stuff about this. And I had mentioned that you came onto my radar fairly recently, but your work had been on my radar for a long time, because when I've gone through your book, a lot of the cases that you're talking about are things that I had seen, like either on social media or in the media. Your hand has been in a lot of investigations that have been really widely splashed across the media, which is really difficult thing to do. As you know, you spent your year, like many decades, like battling with the media and with the USDA. These are very difficult subjects, and it's very recently that I read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle for the first time. Just within the last few months. It's depressing to me how this book, written so long ago, is so eerily similar to what you're describing, whether it's the treatment of the animals or the treatment of the workers, the helplessness of them. Maybe you can speak a little to that.
Well, really, my first book, called Slaughterhouse, was considered like a modern day jungle. Because it described atrocities to animals, the conditions that the workers toiled under, and the dangers that they're confronted with. And it also looked at the serious dangers to consumers from contaminated meat. And so that that book was more like The Jungle. My new book, Out of Sight, doesn't look at contaminated meat so much, but it does mention the conditions that the workers have to endure, and they are really terrible. I mean, they're subjected to such incredibly fast line speeds that they get repetitive motion illnesses, and they I have like a little list of things that happens to the workers.
Yeah.
Let me just look for it. Yeah, they lost limbs, fingers, had breasts caught in machines. People had been burned, stabbed, killed, dropped dead on the line. But the biggest problem was the repetitive motion illnesses, because line speeds are so fast. And the administration, the Trump administration, recently called for lifting of caps on line speeds for one hog every 3 seconds.
Wow. Yeah.
And they're lifting that because that's too slow.
Too slow. Yeah. Can
And
you
they're,
even imagine?
and they're also lifting the cap on birds, from eviscerating birds from 140 birds per minute to 100. They're changing it to 175 birds per minute. That's 3 birds per second. So you can imagine what it's like to work in these facilities. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, just relentless and getting worse. And maybe we can talk, like, I feel like this is more towards, well, let me just ask it now. I would have saved this for later, but there must be just an immense amount of frustration as someone who's worked so long to at least improve conditions, to see them just get worse and worse despite all the great work that you've done. Where does that leave you? Like, it must, I'd feel like an immense amount of anger, I feel like.
Well, I'm like a very hopeful person.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not angry. I just keep plodding along, trying to do the next right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some successes. Certainly, we've had the national veal boycott, which has
Right.
seen a drop in veal production of 89% in the last few decades. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We had an expose on HBO called "Death on a Factory Farm," which was
Mm-hmm.
about, you read about that story where the pigs were being, the mother sows who had been producing pigs for years were disposed of by hanging.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
were able to get that on videotape, and that appeared on HBO 19 times in 1 month. So that was really great. The Washington Post took some begging on my part,
Mm-hmm.
imploring, but I was able to get a Washington Post reporter to do a front page story on the findings of my book and his own findings after he read my book and after I had him interview many of my workers.
Yeah.
So that was at the time, that was the highest reader response piece in the history of the Post, because they ran pictures of a live cow hanging from the rail with its eyes blinking.
Yeah.
And it generated outrage in Congress, and it generated some funding to enforce the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, which had been on the books for 40 years.
Yeah.
And it had been zero budgeted. So there were no funds to enforce the Humane Slaughter Act until that article came out.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You also, I mean, you played a hand in getting places shut down or not built, like the Sioux Reservation, the Rosebud facilities.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was sort of blown away when I was reading about all these successes. Um, that, and like you mentioned, the death on a factory farm. I remember seeing that years ago, and that was like it's a little dated now. It came out a while ago. And back then I was just voraciously watching everything I could. And I remember seeing this pop up on my YouTube feed, Death on a Factory Farm. And I was asking my friends, have you guys seen this movie? It's an incredible story, incredibly depressing. These, like, as you mentioned, these pigs, these mother pigs were being hung, like execution style hangings. It goes to trial and there's one conviction, but mostly they were acquitted of most of the cruelty. It did fortunately lead to a lot of coverage and that sort of thing, like you mentioned. And so it wasn't a complete loss, but it was one of those moments too, where it was just like, what is wrong with our our justice system?
That was one time when I was really, really discouraged, when they were not convicted of the hangings because the judge was a farmer, and he was in the old boys network, and he just didn't want to convict them of that, but he convicted them of some real minor misdemeanor, that so that he could say he convicted them of something. But
Yeah.
it did stop the process. I mean, they never hung another sow again after that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I mean, just talking about the layers that you've had to work through, that was the one time, I believe I have this right, that was the one time where you got a district attorney to take it seriously. So usually it's the district attorney you have to work with, and you actually had a good one that time, who,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's fascinating that he quoted, "I want to be a voice for the voiceless," right? Isn't that amazing?
The only reason we got a good district attorney is because the daughter of the farmer who was hanging the sows worked for the district attorney's office, and they had to change venue.
Yeah, yeah. What?
So,
Yeah. So but then you had the judge, to contend with, who was, like you said,
right.
all boys network. Well, it just really speaks to your tenaciousness. You're where a lot of people would give up and stop, whether it's you dealing with the media, you know, imploring them to run a story, which is often half the battle. You like the investigations alone are hard enough, but then dealing with the media and dealing with the legal aspects, most people would not have persevered in the way that you have, and probably would have hung it up at that point. But
Well,
you did that despite the health issues.
thank you for saying that. That's very nice to hear. Um, we even had the chairman of the Federal Meat Inspectors Union, the individuals who are required to enforce the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, go on video saying we don't do it, we're not allowed to. And I showed that to the media, 60 Minutes and 2020 and Primetime Live and CBS, ABC, Dateline. Dateline came out and interviewed my workers who had been skinning cows completely alive. As you know from reading the book, whereas the cows had no skin left on them and had some of their limbs removed and were still vocalizing and moving their eyes and all sorts of stuff. And Dateline came out and interviewed 12 of them who agreed to go on camera, which was wonderful, without their faces obscured or anything. And then Dateline, just like ABC, CBS, and NBC, said the same words. It's too disgusting. We can't air it.
Yeah, yeah. It's so frustrating. I feel your pain. I know I've dealt with it far much less time than you have, but after leaving public radio and trying to get former stations that I work for to cover it, I still remember this conversation I had with a good friend of mine who told me our listeners can't handle it, when we were talking about the sounds of pigs in gas chambers. And I remember just thinking, as much as I love this person, which I do, I felt like that was such an error to kind of sell the listeners short. In fact, you talk about how this a great Washington Post piece that you persevered in getting published ended up being one of their most viewed and interacted with stories that they've ever published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. It's like the media doesn't give the public credit, and then when the public is given the opportunity to have this information presented to it, they respond vociferously. That was an incredible response to the Washington Post story.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just got to give the public more credit. They deserve to know this information. I don't know why they can show stabbings and murders and all sorts of stuff on TV, but when it comes to animals, it's too disgusting.
Yeah. I mean, really, I've heard someone describe this before. I think it was a reporter who covers factory farming and stuff. And really, they summed it up like, the bosses at these media companies are people who are eating their burgers themselves. And that's usually the issue. It's like they don't actually
Right.
want to know.
Right. I just had an incident with Fresh Air on NPR where they actually requested my book and then they ghosted me.
Wow. Yeah. That's very frustrating because of all the shows that are broadcast on NPR. I would think Terry Gross's program would be the one of all the shows would be the one that would cover this. So at least it's a good sign that they requested the book to begin with.
Well, I wrote them a really heartfelt letter to the managing producer, and he was very enthusiastic in his request. And then that was discouraging when I never heard from him again.
hmm And this is something that you've described, numerous times in your book. Even with the doctors, with your health issues, reaching out to doctors, not hearing back, or that sort of thing. Um, yeah, like you've dealt with this disappointment, and then also the rare successes, in breaking through this wall of stay away, um, numerous times. Um, I don't mean to ask such a cliche question, but where does that come from? Like, why is it that you're able to push through? Like I said, where a lot of people really would just kind of give up, and you just don't seem to take no for an answer.
Well, like I said, I didn't really have a choice. The visual problem that I had made me feel like if I lose my job, what am I going to do? So that propelled me to keep going, but it wasn't so much that just was an adjunct to the whole thing. Um, I just guess I have a sense of an unrealistic sense of optimism because I keep thinking it's going to work, it's going to work, and then it doesn't. But in the final analysis, it does because we push the needle just a little bit each time. And
hmm
when we stopped the Rosebud Sioux hog factory, that prevented 1 million pigs per year from being produced because they were going to be that was going to be a very huge facility, and they were going to be producing almost 1 million pigs a year. So little gains like that are buoy my spirit and help me continue with the
Yeah,
fight. Yeah. You
yeah,
know, you know, Jeremy, as well as I do. In this business, you don't have a choice. You
right.
have to keep fighting. You have to keep fighting.
hmm Yeah, because who do the animals have? They have just this small sliver of the public who knows what's going on. The rest is systematically hidden from them. So who do they have? They've got nobody. And yeah, it does feel like a huge weight of responsibility. Also a privilege, of course, like, it is also a privilege to fight for these animals. Let's go back to the HSUS days because that was fascinating to read. You just mentioned how, like you had these health issues that kind of propelled you along. Well, you described this part in your book where you got a breast cancer diagnosis and you were working right underneath this guy at HSUS who ends up going to prison for life. He was God, he was something. Didn't know about this guy. So we'll talk a little bit about him, but also just he was standing in the way of your slaughterhouse investigation work, and but you felt like I have to stay there because I have breast cancer. I can't lose my health insurance. So you had to work underneath this person who was trying to stymie you during this incredibly important period of your life in your investigation work.
Right. Yeah, I had documented so many cows being skinned alive and so many hogs being immersed in the scalding tank, fully conscious, squealing and kicking, water, splashing water out. I had so much information. I had the support of the Federal Meat Inspectors Union, who were supposed to be enforcing the act and couldn't. And I had a boss that said, a new boss. He came on and he was appointed my boss. And he said, oh, sorry, you can't do your slaughterhouse investigation anymore. All investigations have to be completed in 11 days. And so he was real clear about that I couldn't do it. And yeah, he was a bad guy. I had to quit my job to continue the slaughterhouse work under threat of having no medical insurance.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't sure how I would get medical insurance having survived breast cancer.
Yeah.
But I'm lucky I survived it. So
yeah, you did.
But
You pushed through.
yeah, but I did switch to Humane Farming Association because I knew that they would support my work. And they, in fact, while I was still on medical leave, I took medical leave from HSUS while I was going through breast cancer, but not to nurse myself back to health. It was to go around the country secretly and continue documenting slaughterhouse violations.
Yeah, yeah.
And
in between chemotherapy and stuff, you're doing this, you're going into slaughterhouses and doing this incredible work.
Yeah, and I had been talking with HFA, Humane Farming Association, because I was planning on leaving HSUS before I got the breast cancer diagnosis. But then once I got the diagnosis, I couldn't leave because I needed medical insurance. So when I was flying around the country, documenting violations in different plants while on medical leave, Humane Farming Association was footing the bill for the flights and things like that, which was very kind of them. And then I had to go back to work at HSUS because I couldn't afford to not have medical insurance. And there was a probationary period at Humane Farming Association where you're not sure whether you get hired on permanently or not. So I couldn't afford to quit HSUS, not knowing whether I'd have medical insurance. Yeah. But eventually I just said, the hell with it. I'm quitting, whether I have medical insurance or not.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's sort of a 180. It sounds like HFA has been like the complete opposite of your experience at HSUS, and you've been with them ever since. So it's obviously been a good fit.
Yeah. Humane Farming Association is fantastic. They supported my slaughterhouse work, and they supported everything else I wanted to do ever since. So they've been a wonderful employer. I'm very happy to be with them.
Why do you think it is? I know you can't, I don't know how much thinking you've done about this David Will. We're talking about this David Wills guy who ended up going to prison for life for being a child predator, essentially, which you didn't know about at the time, but you just knew him as somebody who had defrauded people and was at the time, stymieing your work. I don't understand why he was getting in the way of your work. What was his deal? Do you have any idea why?
I mean, I can only surmise, but he wanted to take credit for things. He wanted it to be his investigations. And in fact, there was one story in the book, which I will share, where they had a slaughterhouse meeting and at HSUS, and they wouldn't allow me to attend it, which was funny because I was the only person on staff who was doing any slaughterhouse work. But somebody who attended it told me that this character, David, he bragged that there was a slaughterhouse in Detroit where he had an informant who said that the hogs were trying to right themselves on the rail, meaning they were still fully conscious. So I asked him to, as you know, because you read the book, I asked him to please contact that informant and see if if the informant would talk to me. And I had to remind him several times, and he did. And the informant refused to talk to me. But I went there anyway to that slaughterhouse. And when I got there, it had been out of business for 3 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was just making things up to make himself look impressive, I guess.
Yeah.
When he bragged about his informant.
Yeah.
There was no informant.
And what an evil thing. I mean, not to spend too much time on him, but to get in the way of good work for animals is just not, setting aside even the evil things that he did in his life to other people. Just what a horrible thing to do. I mean, I just can't imagine living my life that way, like doing something that horrible. So I just want to, like, I don't want to spend the whole interview just propping you up, but I just want people to understand you not only had to deal with, layers of bureaucracy and people trying to get in your way at your own organization prior to Humane Farming Association, but also the media, also the government inspectors, also the, prosecutors. And not to mention, the difficulty of doing investigations of animal exploitation industries alone, which is already a difficult thing. That's why I think that's just extraordinary that you've been able to go through that and still be in this line of work and still doing it. Oh, and the health issues.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you. You are propping me up. This is like the best interview.
Yeah. That's how I do it. Yeah. But no, it's just it really is just so extraordinary. Yeah, and so let's talk about a little bit about going through the transition to HFA. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the death on a factory farm, like how that one came about. That one obviously is one that really stood out to me just for how horrific it is. Yeah, maybe talk about some of the specifics there. By the way, I want to say, like you mentioned this other book, Slaughterhouse. I haven't read that book, but just one more thing to gush about you. At the end of finishing Out of Sight, I had already purchased Slaughterhouse, but I started diving into that book right away, which should tell you something about how good the book was. Because, like I said, like, reading about slaughterhouses and stuff is not really something that I relish. It's hard to read about. So the fact that I dove right into your previous book, which came out, what was it, 1996 or 1997, to read back and get this sort of, like you said, update of the jungle in a way. It would normally be something that I don't dive into with, gusto.
Yeah. Well, you will find that there is some similarities between the two books, because the second book is a memoir, so there is some information from the first book in the second book because it is my life story. So
Right.
Yeah. But as far as death on a factory farm, we received a complaint from a woman named Ingrid DiMarino. She's a wonderful person, an absolutely compassionate human being. She was working on a farm, and she said they're hanging the sows here. They're doing other things too, like awful things, like attaching the sows to the back of a truck and driving them down the gravel road while they were still alive and things like that. And she was begging management just to shoot the poor sows, but they wouldn't. So we got an undercover investigator in, and he was able to document all sorts of violations at that facility. It was just terrible. And but then when he finally got the sows being hung, what they did is they hot-shotted them down the alley because they couldn't walk anymore. They were so spent. They prodded them down the alley and they dragged themselves as far as they could, and then they kicked them. We have all this on video. And then they tossed them over a 4-foot ledge out of the barn onto the freezing cold pile of other sows. And then they watched as their fellow sows had a chain fastened around their necks, and the chain was attached to the tines of a front end loader, and the tines of the front end loader were lifted, and the sows struggled for 5 minutes until they finally suffocated under their own weight. It was horrible. The worst part of that was seeing the sows watching the other sows and seeing what was going to happen to them. That was the worst part. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, by this point in your career, you had seen so much. I mean, you had, not to be so gruesome, but I mean, you even tell the story about how you had to go collect eyes, you know, like when you were testing for this drug. You were just, you know, knee deep, you know, in such horrible things by this point. Maybe speak a little bit about to how you've managed to deal with that mentally, because it's hard to even read about, much less see, experience.
Right. Well, as I say in Out of Sight, I just was emotionally shut down, and that served me and enabled me to do this kind of stuff. One thing I said is I will never excise eyeballs from pigs, and then I found myself doing it at a rendering plant. I just was emotionally shut down, and I think that was from childhood. And I think I am starting to, I was like frozen, just frozen. And I always felt like I needed to take an ice pick and just get in touch with my feelings. But I think I'm starting to thaw now. And that's what I say at the end of the book, that I'm having less, I had so much self-contempt because of my eye problem. And I thought I was doing it to myself because all the doctors, 100 doctors told me that there's nothing wrong with you. So I convinced myself that I was doing it to myself. So I had abject self-disdain, and that's lifted. And it's so wonderful because now I have self-compassion.
Yeah.
And so, but that's how I did it. I was just frozen.
Yeah. Well, I found that in myself reading your book, because like I mentioned at the beginning, the moments that I really felt were the details that were so personal to you when you were describing the animals. And I'm wondering if it's because the problem is so vast, you know, it's happening to so many animals. I wonder if that's why I have sort of that shield up myself, or if it's like similar to you. I've seen it, I've seen so much, heard so much, witnessed so much at this point that I have that protective shield up. But there's just something about it when you're sort of given these clinical descriptions of what's happening to the animals, where I felt numb to it, in a way that you describe yourself feeling in the book. And it was those moments with family that I sort of like kind of got, like I said, got punched in the gut a little bit and actually felt something. I don't know what that is, if it's a defense mechanism, or it could also, I even allow this possibility that it could be speciesism in myself, that maybe I'm, you know, less relating to these animals, or maybe it's just that it's too big.
I wouldn't think it was speciesism. I think it's just self-protection.
Yeah. Yeah, you're probably right, because I mean, we do empathize with animals a lot. I think it is one thing when you're reading something, it's just sort of like back to back. And I mean, and I hope this doesn't dissuade people from reading your book. It's just that it is some of the toughest stuff to read. Like I said, it is interspersed with your personal story that kind of makes it more digestible in a way. Um, but yeah, it's some of the, it's just some absolutely horrible things. And it's not surprising to me that you would have dealt with things throughout your life, your health problems, wondering, am I just insane? Which is a question that you asked yourself multiple times dealing with your eye issue, when the doctors kept telling you, no, it's fine, there's nothing wrong. Luckily, it sounds like you did have some good doctors along the way that kind of were getting to it.
Right. They weren't getting to it. They were just making suggestions that were kind of in line with what it ended up being. But
Yeah.
it wasn't an established medical diagnosis until 2014. It
Right.
didn't exist. So it was impossible to diagnose me with something that didn't exist in the medical literature. And
Right.
now it does, and now there are Facebook groups about it and everything. It's a very rare thing, but people that have it on Facebook are just, it's so sad. They're just going crazy. I'm so much better than I was. So much better.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, in preparing for this interview, I looked back to see what sort of interviews you'd been doing recently, and I just listened to just the one that I think was the most recent, and that was the Let's Talk Memoir interview,
Mhm.
where you were discussing that the problem has somewhat dissipated for you, that it's not nearly as severe as it was, or as severe. Yeah, I guess I have that question too. Like you mentioned, seeing the world in pixels and dots. Is that still current? Is that how you see things right now?
Yeah, that's just my way of seeing the world. It's how I've always seen the world.
Mm,
So I'm used to that. That's not a problem. It was
yeah.
the other stuff, the the dyslexia of the world. Like you'd go on a hike in the forest, and the trees would be so confusing because there were so many of them, and it was just totally confusing. Or you go in a department store, and the lighting in the department store would send your brain into panic. It
Hmm.
was just really, but the derealization was the worst because you felt like you were drunk. You
Yeah.
felt like
Yeah.
you weren't in your body. You felt like you were drunk. Nothing was real. And that happened a lot.
Yeah.
So,
Including at major moments of your life where you were accepting an award and you had to give a speech, and you describe, all the anticipation and build up, knowing, oh God, I don't feel right. And I'm gonna have to get up and speak. That must have been just terrifying to go through.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was. Yeah.
yeah. But that does also there is also a triumph in that story, because you are being, recognized for your work, and the great, investigatory work that you've done over the years. You were awarded I wasn't aware of it, but the Albert Schweitzer, I think it was called,
Hmm.
award. And you mentioned, and sorry to give away the stories, I don't mean to tell everybody the whole book, but you mentioned that people seem to understand that you were going through it uh, when you
Uh,
gave your speech.
Not really.
Oh,
They
really?
didn't know. They did not know. I
Yeah.
just
Well,
I
you
just
mentioned they still lauded you, applauding.
Oh
Did that?
yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
yeah. They were clueless as to what was going on with me, but
Mm,
I fudged my way through it, and they gave me a standing ovation.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the work speaks for itself. I mean, um, it's a it's really hard for any kind of stuff like this to break through, to get media attention. So I have a huge amount of respect and gratitude that you've been able to do that, and to get this to a wide audience. That's, and that sort of brings me to I guess a question about, you had mentioned that, the book Slaughterhouse had done quite well, and it must have felt good to like have, suddenly people recognizing and it must feel good to know that people are starting to get a sense of what was going on, breaking through this, wall of disinformation that most people are fed through their entire life. And yeah, how, like, what were the moments like in your life where you really felt like, wow, this is breaking through, this is doing some good?
Well, with slaughterhouse, it was funny. It was not so much disinformation as just nobody had ever looked to see what was going on in slaughterhouses ever. And so it was very gratifying when my old boss at Animal Welfare Institute, who's the one that got the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act passed in 1958, called me and thanked me for my work. That was very gratifying. But mostly the satisfaction that I've gotten has come mostly from those few victories that we've had, like
Hmm.
death on a factory farm and shutting down the Rosebud Sioux hog
Yeah.
factory and things like that.
Yeah, you've had these incredible wins, and that kind of makes me want to ask too, like, I know, like, my audience are primarily vegan, animal rights activists, and some people have, like, I wonder how you're received with a group that has the name Humane Farming Association. I'm sure you're aware that a lot of people push back on the idea of humane, or the idea that there should be a humane methods of slaughter, and how that's contradictory, and that sort of thing. So
Right.
yeah, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because Humane Farming Association was named 40 years ago.
Hmm.
And we're an animal rights group. We're vegans, we're an animal rights group. That just happens to be our name.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's not like we support humane farming.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
just that's our name from 40 years ago.
Yeah, I just wondered if you get that kind of pushback a lot, if you have to answer to it a lot, which I would imagine would be fairly frustrating considering the amount of great work that you've done.
Not really. I think we have a big enough reputation. We have vegans, we have meat eaters, we have everybody on our as supporters, but we're
Hmm.
teaching the meat eaters what the problems are. So maybe they'll change their ways. And we have vegans. I'm a vegan. I mean, we're your typical animal rights group, but we have a reputation. We have 300,000 members, and we have a reputation that precedes us. People know that we're what we do, so that's good.
Yeah, yeah. How do you deal with it in your personal life? So for instance, I finished your book this morning. I was in this diner that I go to where, it's not a vegan diner, so they have some vegan stuff. How do you deal with the frustration of that? I was wearing this like brutal slaughterhouse t-shirt that had, and I'm seeing people order the bacon, the eggs and stuff. Like, do you, it sounds to me, I mean, you're so steeped in this world and have been for so long that uh, I wonder, how have you felt those like moments where you're just out and about and just wondering like, how do I get through to people? Um, Especially doing all these great investigations, like, um, does it affect you, or do you kind of like shut that out, like when it's just like people around you in your day to day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I do shut it out, except for I'm I'm I've become more clear over the years as to my feelings about eating animals, and now it's just senseless.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
absolutely senseless. So um, it troubles me, but I mostly shut it out.
Hmm.
And I do my part that I can do to educate the world. I mean, getting Out of Sight published was amazing because even the animal rights publishers wouldn't touch it, would
Really?
not
Wow.
touch it, would
Wow.
not touch it. And then I
Well,
found a wonderful publishing house that is anti-censorship,
mm,
and took me almost 100 queries to get my book published.
wow. Another instance of your tenaciousness, right? Not
Mhm.
giving up on that. Um, Yeah, you sort of mentioned at the end of the book, and I guess the afterword, that you're hoping that this book will, sort of reach beyond animal rights people, and that's where your personal story and your personal struggles maybe hopefully does help broaden out to people who may be struggling with similar issues, uh, and that sort of thing. That's interesting that this book publisher had nothing to do with animals, and that animal publishers were turning it down.
Yeah,
Um, have you that's interesting because the interview that I asked you about before, the Let's Talk memoir, was clearly beyond this world. Is I guess this was a podcast about memoirs,
yeah,
which which is really cool. So it's already, reaching an audience that isn't animal rights related. Ironically, the woman who was interviewing you had mentioned that this is an interest of hers. She was pretty interested in animal rights topics. So that was
right.
helpful. But are you finding that it is kind of reaching past the world of like the animal rights world beyond this interview?
Well, my publisher set me up with a lot of podcasts on Rumble. I don't know if you're familiar with Rumble, but it's like,
Yeah, I am.
yeah, it's kind of like the conservative YouTube. And
Yeah.
so it was very interesting that that's who they set me up with interviews with. But
Hmm.
those people were extremely receptive to what I had to say. So that was interesting. But as I wrote in my book proposal, which was a big deal that I had to do in order to get the book published, I wrote that the purpose of the book is not to just reach vegans, which is important. It's an
Hmm.
important starting place, but most vegans know a lot of this stuff. But it was written as a memoir to reach mainstream
Yeah.
readers. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping that's going to happen.
Yeah, and I guess your book has been out just it's not been out that long, right? May, right? I think it
Yeah,
was when it came
May.
out. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So I guess my what I would implore you, the viewer, to do is to get Gail's book. Um, even knowing that, this is a topic that you may even know about. It's I do this sometimes, and I don't know if this is how effective it is, but sometimes I'll get a book that I don't like. This is maybe something weird that I do. Sometimes I'll get a book that I didn't even intend on reading to support it. Um, because the only chance is that it's going to reach a mainstream audience is if the people who have a core interest in it also show the interest and support it. So my hope is that vegans and animal rights people will pick up your book and read it. And like I said, it really will get you in different ways that you don't expect. And that's what I'm finding every time I get one of these books that I think, it's happened to me multiple times doing this podcast where I thought, okay, I'm going to read this book, so that I can conduct a respectful interview, but not expecting to have like really epiphany moments, like I found in your book. Um, yeah,
good. That's great. Yeah, I just I'm trying to get it out there as much as possible because I think it will really shed light on what animals go through, um, farm animals endure in the
yeah,
mainstream public. That's what I want.
absolutely, it will. And I mean, even in that interview, you were talking with a woman who identified herself as vegetarian, and there's a big long section in your book about dairy calves, and that's one of the I'm sure when she was reading it, she was like, "Whoa, like the dairy industry," Yeah,
Yeah, good.
yeah, yeah. I'm hopeful that it does reach these audiences, that it really does give you some of the most horrific things that happens to animals.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's not
maybe
surprising because we spend well, the USDA, I'll just throw this out there. The USDA spends less than 3% of its meat inspection budget on enforcing the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. Less than 3%. I think it's 2.5% now. When it comes to enforcing the law that affects the animals who fuel the entire system, it's
Right.
unconscionable.
Right. Yeah, and you also talk about the depopulation and how much of our tax dollars are going to indemnify farmers who oftentimes are just leaving their animals to die or and then killing them in horrific ways. Our tax dollars are going to pay them for the animals that have died. In fact, maybe we could talk about, I'm sorry that this is such a grim, brutal, gory sounding interview, but maybe we could talk about this, another example of where I had seen this thing that you were talking about, which was the depopulation of these pigs who were basically burned and buried alive in these pits. You described it as the most horrible thing that you'd ever seen.
Well, I didn't actually observe it myself
Yeah,
physically. I saw it on video.
right.
It was the worst thing I've ever seen. They were, and this is going to make people not want to read the book but it is the worst thing in the book. This was in China. They were forcing pigs to jump into a cavern, not a cavern, a pit, with a front end loader, forcing them into this pit, and they would jump in, probably break bones, I don't know. And then they were all down there squealing. These were market-sized pigs that they were killing because of African swine fever. And so then they rained down fireballs on them and let the fireballs just explode on them.
Yeah.
And then you could hear the pigs squealing and groaning, and then the fire just went out and the pigs were still groaning. And so then they just took the soil that made the pit and used the front end loaders to pour the soil down on top of the pigs. And that's how they killed them.
Yeah. Well, you describe this and then you talk about how this isn't just done in China. This specific incident, of course, was in China, but they are depopulating animals with COVID, with bird flu making the rounds. We have these horrific, and I think a lot of my listeners / viewers are already going to know about these things, but ventilation shutdown. Luckily, at least in our circles, news about that sort of stuff has made the rounds, I think. In fact, I think some people may have even seen this pit in China if you follow certain channels and that sort of thing. But I think, kind of where I want to get to with that is just the fact that so much of our money is being poured into this. And that's one of the most depressing things, is that even as vegans, our money's being taken from us through taxes and then fed into these industries to almost incentivize this kind of behavior.
Right. Well, that's true with the livestock indemnity program, which we're fighting to get reformed. I mean, farmers, producers are indemnified without buying insurance or anything for animals that die in adverse weather. Like if 40,000 cows and calves suffocated in a snowstorm in New Mexico. And so they just got indemnified. They just got 75% of the value of the animals. And that's without having provided them any shelter or protection or anything from the elements. They just, since 2008, USDA has paid out $500 million for millions of dead livestock and poultry. So we're doing something that's probably not as activist as some would like, but we're just trying to make a change that says that these producers need to have disaster preparedness plans before they ever receive any money. We had a bill introduced in Congress that required that, and we're trying to get it reintroduced now. But I think Wayne Shung was talking about the fact that now the big ugly bill includes animals that are pregnant, and the fetuses should be, producers should be reimbursed for the fetuses.
Right. Just insane. It's just insane. And how do we keep our sanity when this is going on? And I guess that's where maybe, you know, with someone who's been in the struggle like you have, what do you view as like our best ways to push back on stuff like this? I know nobody has the single answer, because otherwise we'd have animal liberation, but I know there's a few calls to action in your book at the end, which are great, and they're things that people can do. And by the way, we'll make sure that we link to your website and HFA's website so that people can get to those things that they can, actions that they can take. But I guess for my viewers, for the people listening to this, what are some of the things that they can do that you think would be the most effective uses of their time?
Well, I think this sounds self-serving, but share the book. Share the book so that people outside of the vegan community want to read it. Because like you said, there are some troubling aspects in the book. Excuse me. But the story of my struggles holds the reader's attention and gets them through the book.
Yeah, it does. I can attest to that. Because as many of the harrowing details that we've discussed, you can get through them pretty quickly. And that's why I'm saying to people, like, if you get stuck on some of those points in the book, just push through.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, all the reader reviews on Amazon are fantastic, but one reader just wrote the other day, find this book. This book reads mostly as a thriller, a suspenseful medical mystery woven into the tale of Gail Eisnitz. And then it says all this great stuff about me, which I won't read.
Nice. Maybe we should share that one.
But in
maybe
addition,
I wrote that one. No, I didn't.
I actually know the person that wrote that. She's a screenwriter.
Nice.
She's a Hollywood screenwriter. So.
Oh, really? You know, it occurred to me. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, share the book, join the Humane Farming Association, write letters to the editor, particularly about the livestock indemnity program.
Yeah.
Share on social media. I have a Instagram page now, so visit that. That's really a good thing. And those are just my suggestions.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that you were like reading a lot about the Holocaust. I remembered that I wanted to give you a book recommendation of my own. I had this woman on my program. I wonder if you know her. Her name is Lisa Lapel. She lived in the town that you live in at one point. Anyway, Lisa, when she was 9 years old, she was growing up in Nazi Germany. She learned that her parents were Nazis, and she's now an animal rights activist, a civil rights activist. She was on my program, but her book is called My Neighbor's Son. It's also a memoir about her life, which is extraordinary. And yeah, I thought you might be interested in that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, her story is incredible. And yeah, why is it that you gravitated toward that style of book? You mentioned like reading a lot about the Holocaust.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm Jewish, but that's not the reason. The reason is because it helps me understand how people can be so cruel to animals, if they could do that to humans just, a few decades ago,
Hmm.
they could do that to humans, then of course they could do that to pigs. I saw a video recently, you may have seen it too, I forget where I saw it, of somebody taking a big board and slapping a sow in the gestation crate just to make her stand because they need to stand every day.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what is that about? I
Yeah.
mean, the whole thing is sick. But anyway, the Holocaust books make me understand how we can be so cruel to animals because we could be that cruel to humans. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually doing a live stream earlier today and mentioned the movie Zone of Interest, which is that movie about the Nazis who lived right adjacent to the concentration camp, and they're having like picnics and stuff, and you're hearing in the background like gunshots and people screaming. And I thought this is a great, representation of how we treat animals without the filmmakers intending that. We go about our lives, pretending that this doesn't happen. Like I was in the diner earlier today, just watching people order their food. And yeah, we just like, it's so sad that we just like pretend that it's not going on. And that kind of explains it, I think, doesn't it? We separate ourselves from it.
I took a class in the Holocaust at a continuing education center, and in the next room, literally the next room, they were teaching a class about how great Temple Grandin is.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And it was like,
Temple, yeah, and you've mentioned Temple in your book actually several times, right? I'm
yeah,
not mixing my books. Actually, didn't she write something supportive of, well, at least one of your findings, I think.
yeah. But just the concept, she enables the systematic. I mean, some people think she's done good things.
Hmm.
She also enables the systematic slaughter. And it was interesting that they were teaching a course on her right next door to a course on the Holocaust.
Right, right. Yeah. I know. I saw some of my friends, one of my friends actually, there was this video that they made with Temple Grandin, and one of my friends was sort of trying to press her on some questions about like just basic questions like how could this be okay? And it was like she hadn't thought of it. It was unbelievable. Like how could this be your whole life? And she just didn't have a good answer. It's unbelievable to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really incredible. I wonder if we could talk about a little bit about like sort of the more personal aspects of your book. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but there are just some really poignant moments that you had with family, um, with friends over the years that, like I mentioned earlier, really kind of those were the moments that kind of jabbed at my heart a little bit,
Mhm.
about your parents, um, and you know that experience that you had at Duke University. I don't know. That's late in the book. I don't know if we want to spoil everything that happens in the book. So maybe you make the call on that.
Yeah, maybe I won't talk about that, but I will just say that my parents had a very fractious marriage and it was very difficult. They were fighting a lot, and my dad tried to commit suicide and things
Oh
like
wow.
that. So,
I
but
that I will say that was like that's a very brief little mention in your book that your parents had gotten divorced. But it was heartbreaking because you mentioned how like you were felt so heartbroken for your dad who was going through such struggles at that time.
yeah,
Um,
because he was 82 and my mom was 75 when they got divorced.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he was handicapped and it was very difficult.
yeah. How did that affect you? I mean, I feel like you had so many struggles throughout your life that it seemed like it was a struggle for your parents and your family to know how to approach you and talk to you about those things. But how did like that divorce affect you, and how did your parents' fractious relationship affect you, or did you kind of block it out as much as you could?
No, I think that had a big impact on me. I mean, not the divorce. By that time, I was a grown person,
Yeah,
but the relationship and the fighting, it was scary as a kid.
yeah,
And I think it set me up for suppressing some of my feelings.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
I also want to say, without giving away this very special friendship that you had with Timothy, which we touched on earlier, that's also one of the real like heartrending moments for me is your discussions with Timothy. And I guess I can say that, you did receive this really kind letter from him that I think that was very special. I don't think that's given too much away. Kind of thanking you for your focus on the animals.
Yeah.
Um, that's a
Yeah.
really cool friendship you had through your life.
Yeah. He was a great guy. He was just so invested in making the world a better place for animals. And he was a USDA employee, and he wanted to help the animals, but he became a very dear friend.
Yeah. I always sort of ask people like, because we're dealing with such heavy subjects, I like to ask people just like what they get into outside of this, like, like how they unwind, that sort of thing. What kind of stuff do they like to watch or read, that isn't dealing with these subjects?
Yeah. I laugh because I would say nothing. It's all animals all the time.
All animals, yeah.
No, but I I live in a very lovely place, not too far from you,
That's right.
and I have a lot of friends. We walk a lot. We walk and talk a lot, and I have
Yeah.
a spiritual life in a 12-step program and
Yeah.
otherwise. And so I'm very blessed to have so many good friends. And so I just feel like the 12-step program has taught me how to be more emotionally intimate with people.
hmm
And it's enabled me to have more compassion for myself.
Yeah.
So I also really enjoy photography.
Oh,
And
really? Nice.
particularly when I'm traveling, I like to take photographs. So,
Nice, nice.
yeah.
Um, well, we mentioned like all the ways that people can get involved. I'll make sure that we link those below. I wanted to cover your book, but not cover too much of it that we spoil things. But let me just ask you, do you think there's any like critical parts that we didn't cover that we should cover, or or anything else that you want to touch on?
I don't think so. I think that the only other thing is and I think we sort of mentioned this, the fights that I had with law enforcement officials,
Yeah.
and particularly attorneys general in 6 states where we prepared open and shut, unbelievable cases with 800 pages of testimony per case from witnesses. And the attorneys general were so interested in protecting big ag that they refused to even consider prosecuting. So
hmm
that's just another struggle.
Yeah,
But
a really frustrating struggle. And that's why we mentioned the one that you got that actually was very invested in helping out. There are, it is interesting. There are some people along the way. There's even the senator that you mentioned, Robert Byrd, and I think I got his name right, right? Yeah, that
yeah,
that had given that. speech on the Senate floor to get, more money for the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And um, every now and then you meet some people who are really like driven by compassion. And I guess that's the glimmer of hope that we have, is that there are some of those people still out there.
Right. I think that for a lot of people, it's ignorance is bliss. That's why I want to share my book so badly, because I think that maybe once they know, they'll change their ways.
Hmm.
So that's why I wrote a memoir, because I thought I could reach people who don't know this stuff, and maybe they'll change their ways if they follow along on the storyline that I present.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think if they read the book, and that's the challenge, is just to see if people will read the book, because I'm very confident that if they do read the book, that they will. I mean, you'd have to be a monster to not even consider changing your ways after reading some of the horrible things that you've written about. It would just, you know, and like we talked about earlier, I don't sell people short. Like, I feel like people can handle it. They can deal with the truth, and I have
Yeah.
high expectations that people will change when they are faced with the reality.
And the last thing I would say is that the examples that I include in the book, I mean, we have everything on videotape. Um, but the examples I include in the book are just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, you've mentioned at one point that as the horrible things that you're described, there's things worse than that. And I know, like, you know, yeah, I just have an immense amount of gratitude for you. I was once tasked with reviewing slaughterhouse footage, like hours and hours of it, just and you've been doing it for a very long time, and it takes its toll. It can really take its toll. And like you said, you have to really mentally shut it off. And yeah, it's amazing that there's stuff left on the cutting room floor. And I've heard people say that a lot, where they'll put out a documentary like a Dominion or a Earthlings. And as horrible as those things that are depicted that are there are things that are worse than that they didn't show because they were so bad. And that's
Right,
amazing.
right.
Yeah.
And one other thing I'll mention is that 55 years, you might know this, 55 years ago, we killed 10 billion animals in the world. And
Hmm.
here it is 55 years later, and we killed 10 billion animals in the United States alone a year.
Yeah.
Isn't that shocking?
It's unbelievable. And yeah, that's one of the things you did was kind of go through the numbers. And we should mention, you talked about how, you barely didn't really touch on chickens as much in this book as you did in
Right.
Slaughterhouse. And the numbers are staggering with chickens. And then when you get into fish and marine life, it's just
Mhm.
we're in the trillions. It's unbelievable, the havoc that we wreak on this planet, and its life forms. So yeah, I'm glad that, what I heard in your last interview that I listened to, that you mentioned that you didn't feel like you had to have the entire weight of the world on you, that you were able to find some compassion and deal with yourself. And like you wrote about in your book, you had compassion for animals and all these people in your life, and you had no compassion for you. I'm glad that you found the compassion for yourself and realizing you alone, maybe us, together, we can solve these problems, but you alone don't have to do it all.
That's a pretty presumptuous belief, isn't it?
Yeah, we can
That
do.
I had to
Yeah.
do it all by myself.
But you did an extraordinary job, and the work continues, like you mentioned, right? Like you're not done. You're still with HFA. You're still working. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
The
So
case is clear.
yeah, I would highly encourage people to support HFA. Sounds like they do incredible work, and please get Gail's book. It's an amazing read, and I don't just say that because I have her on the podcast. It really did get to me in a way that I was not expecting, and I think that's uh, what for an animal rights book, that you feel like you're going to read a lot of the same stuff that you've read in another book. This isn't that book. This you will find different stuff in this book, and I highly encourage you to pick it up. And the earlier book, which I can't vouch for because I haven't read it yet, but have started. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Well, it was lovely talking to you, Gail.
Thank you, Jeremy. I hope we meet up.
Yeah,
in
me
our
too. Me
respective
too.
addresses. I mean, we don't live that far from each other, so
Exactly. We should definitely grab a coffee or something.
yeah.